Hello, my name is Brian McMillan, and I'm here not as a representative of an environmental organization, but as someone who, because of his technological skills, has been involved in a number of campaigns for organizations like Greenpeace, Pollution Probe, the Toronto Environmental Alliance, Rainforest Alliance, a number of other groups, over the course of my life. And what I want to do is take a slightly different tack from the tacks that we taken by other people, and just simply tell two of my favorite stories about what I think are two of the most significant campaigns that I've participated on, and then just make a couple of very simple comments about what I think was most successful. And I'll actually do the spoiler right now. My personal feeling is that digital technology should always be employed in the service of very particular goals, and when you're employing it, you should be very aware of the human networks that you're dealing with, because that's how you get messages communicated and spread. So let's get started. I'm going to start off with a bit of history. I'm going to go back to the 20th century. Oops, wait a second. This is, oh my goodness. Okay, it's the wrong.
This is a cool slideshow, though.
It's the wrong one. I took the politics out because I thought that it was a little bit contentious, but I can go with it. It's fine. Okay, so when was the last time that New York voted Republican? Oops, excuse me. And the answer is 1984. And I was actually alive back then. I'm in my 30s now. And the deal was Reagan's back-to-back victories in the United States and Margaret Thatcher's victory in back-to-back victories in the United Kingdom created a considerable amount of consternation among progressives. And this led to the first story that I want to tell you about. It's a rather interesting story. The spread of the internet to Brazil, and arguably the spread of the internet to much of the developed world, and to certain, the developing world, and much of the developed world as well. So here's the backstory. Here's the revisionist story that I want to tell you, because it's one that people don't really know, and it's very, very important that we should know it as activists. So the dominant story about the explosive growth of the internet in the early 1990s is that it was caused by the merger of the graphic user interface developed for Netscape with HTML, Tim Berners-Lee, with the TCP/IP protocol, which was the backbone for communication that was developed by DARPA. And the idea was these technologies merged magically around 1993, 1994, and then suddenly there was a global internet. As it turns out, it didn't really work that way. If you analyze the stats, and if you look at the distribution of networks around the world, you realize that this story is a story about California, and to a lesser extent, the university community in the United States, and to an even lesser extent, the university communities in North America and Europe. So the deal is that this global network was actually predated, the internet was predated by a whole series of national and international networks. For example, you have LexisNexis, which was responsible for doing legal research, Edgar, which was a network for securities trading, BitNet, which academics used, Minitel, which is just this French thing. And though interestingly, Canada actually did an implementation of Minitel, I discovered when I was researching this, which is kind of interesting. It completely flopped. It had a 0 retention rate. And then you have these other organizations I'm going to talk about a little bit here. GreenNet in the UK, iBase in Brazil, Nicaragua, etc. A bunch of them. The one that I was associated with, which was Web Networks in Canada, Econet and PeaceNet in the United States. Which brings us back to the Gipper. So the deal is that what happened was in the mid-1980s, a whole bunch of people who were associated with those organizations that I'm talking about got together, pretty much, the kernel of the story is they got together in a hotel room with Peter Gabriel in New York in 1987. There's a whole other, there's many more details to that, but they got together and they decided that what they had to do was start integrating. And this is sort of the history of the integration right here. In 1984, it was interdoc with fax, right? So that's sort of a little bit before our story. And then you get PeaceNet developing, Econet, GreenNet start developing in the mid-1980s. And then in 1987, this gets back to the Peter Gabriel story that I was talking about. PeaceNet takes over Econet, and they form the Institute for Global Communications. And that is, that development was something that was encouraged by the Tides Foundation. they sat down and said, listen, you guys, we've got a big enemy against us, or whatever, an adversary against us. We've got to pull ourselves together and start communicating. And then that leads immediately afterwards to IGC and GreenNet getting together. GreenNet was the UK equivalent. And then in 1990, IGC joins these organizations, and they create what is virtually a global network that's based on pretty much telephone communication with the Unix backend. So it's using the TCP/IP technology that is later adopted for the intranet, but mostly that's within internal networks that are connected through the phone system. And then in 1991, they actually begin the first tentative connections to what we know of as the internet. Which leads to one of the two stories that I want to tell you. And one that I think we really should that many people are not aware of, but is a really important story, which is what I consider to be one of the greatest environmental successes ever, which was the Rio Summit on climate change. And what I want to talk about is the role of these, particularly the APC, in the Rio Summit. So this is just sort of a background. And actually, I want to leave this up. I actually edited it from the other version, but it's kind of worth mentioning. In the late 1980s, this is from the New York Times in 1988, we were talking about exactly the same things that we're talking about now. Right? I don't know whether you remember, but 1986, 1987, 1988, and 89, no, it was 85 to 88 were three of the hottest years on record. Right? So everyone was talking about how, oh no, what's going on? Why is it so hot? And that's where the whole discussion about climate change really starts taking off. And so we're really aware of it, and that's sort of the background story of what's going on. But let's get back to my main story. And the main story is that the Association for Progressive Communications got the contract to provide information services to the summit. And this was a really big deal. I don't know whether, not everyone here will remember the summit, but somewhere around 20,000 NGOs attended. APC at that time represented 11,000 of them. So it was a gigantic summit that brought together people from all around the world. And from my research and experience, only Citibank at that time had a comparable global network. I know of no other organization at all that had that kind of reach. That is to say, a global reach, right? Because APC was communicating using satellite technology that some buddies of mine were running around with in backpacks in Zimbabwe and South Africa, as well as doing more formal networks, in the Nordic countries, Europe, and North America and Latin America. So APC gets this contract, and the way it plays out is really, really fascinating. The story is, the full story revolves around this fellow named Carlo Alfonso. And his story was that he was exiled first from Brazil to Chile, and then from Chile after the Pinochet coup, he comes to Canada, where he becomes a professor at York University. He founds in Canada this thing called Bytes, which is a Brazilian network. And he returns in Brazil in 1990 with one Apple II, 2 floppy disks, which incidentally he has to smuggle in because there were technology controls in Brazil at that time. And because of his Canadian connections, works with web networks in Toronto and the Tides Foundation in Canada, which is sort of a branch of the American Tides Foundation, to work on computerizing the Rio conference. And so practically what happened was some money from pretty much some philanthropists in California go to these activists in Toronto who are buying like Apple II computers, sticking them into their luggage, and smuggling them down to Brazil, where they turn into the backbone of the Brazilian internet, as well as the communications backbone for the Rio Summit. These are just a couple of quotes about that, but I don't want to get too bogged down in the story. And anyway, so the point I want to make about this story is there's sort of 2 points. The first one is just the revisionist story, which is a lot of the dissemination of the internet was actually done by progressive organizations. Right? We've got this myth that it's all about universities. It wasn't, right? Because if you think about it, many sectors of society were impacted by the spread of the internet. And so in this aspect, this revisionist story I'm telling, all these NGOs in North America, South America, Europe, and Oceania were connected through the APC. And so the internet was actually distributed through these people. And if you think about it, if you think about the way technology transfers work, it makes sense, right? Because people didn't know how to copy files. They didn't know what a floppy disk was, right? So the knowledge transfers that were happening there disseminated very, very broadly. Okay, so I've got 5 minutes left, so let's finish with this. So the first point is, remember the Rio Summit. It totally transformed the debate about the environment, right? It went from being on no one's agenda to suddenly being one of the major topics of the 1990s. And incidentally, it led to the spread of the internet to Brazil, the creation of the Lua programming language, among other things, and the deposition of their president. So let's quickly go on to the second. And this is the second story. This is something I did a few years later. Same sort of technology transfer story. And the idea is that I was just hired to go to Sulawesi. Wrong thing, but I'll just wing it. I just went to Sulawesi where I was working on a project to do field research for an environmental group using cell phones. So the idea, again, you've got something similar to what was happening with the Rio Summit. With Rio, you're dealing with this V23 technology, 1200 baud uploads, right? So it would take like 3 days to download a movie, for example. In Sulawesi, I'm dealing with cell phones, and we're using the cell phones as a way of doing market research, doing field research, identifying endangered species, plants, etc., and most importantly, integrating these farmers who are living in houses that are literally made of driftwood to yuppie markets in London and New York. And this sort of leads to, because I only have a minute left, let me just finish with my main story. And my main story is that I'm a technologist, and these two experiences, which in both cases have been very, very successful projects. So this whole thing with the the coffee farmers has really transformed the lives of the coffee farmers, improved our environment, and made a very dramatic and positive impact. What I've learned from this is prosaic technologies work very, very well. So if you find yourself focusing on your technology, how glossy your website is and the clicks and stuff like that, maybe your eye's off the ball, because you have to think about the human elements, because they're very important, which leads to my second point, which is, in both of these stories, the successes were fundamentally based on human networks, right? It was like this one guy, Carlo Alfonso, who ended up being a catalyst for these various different groups and had a transformative effect on the Brazilian economy and indirectly on our whole perception of environmental issues. So I guess that's it. I want to take sort of a counter. If you're talking about collectivism, if you're saying you got 1,000 clicks, my question to you is, whose minds have you changed? Which people have you talked to? Things along those lines. So I'm hoping that I can sort of introduce that into our debate a little bit, just sort of as a devil's advocate, the technologist who's a Luddite, if you will. So thank you very much for your time.